Welcome to Secrets in Slumber. It is 1945, the final year of the Second World War. The Pacific lies in ruins, and the air across the Philippines carries the tired breath of armies retreating through smoke and rain. In the highlands of Luzon, the nights grow strangely calm, too calm for a world still on fire. Far from the cities, the jungle hums with quiet purpose. Crickets pulse in the warm darkness, and the rivers slip through the valleys like veins of glass beneath the moon. Among the trees, men move carefully, their torches veiled, their engines muted beneath heavy tarps. Convoys of trucks crawl through the mist, carrying not soldiers now, but secrecy. Inside the wooden crates are objects taken from across Asia, temple relics, gold bars, jeweled statues, offerings of devotion and empire alike. They say the orders came from General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the Tiger of Malaya, who knew the war was ending, and that what could not be saved must be hidden. Tunnels were dug into volcanic rock, chambers reinforced with steel, and passageways sealed behind stone. Some claimed these were vaults of victory, others tombs for the defeated. When the surrender finally came, the jungle began its slow reclaiming. The entrances vanished beneath vines. The workers who remained were swallowed by silence. And over time, the mountains themselves became the vault, their roots binding the treasure to the heart of the earth. Villagers would later tell stories of strange lights flickering on foggy nights, of the ground echoing with hollow sounds when struck by a stick. Farmers unearthed pieces of metal too pure to rust. Hunters found carved symbols deep within caves that had no human paths leading to them. What was hidden, no one could say for sure. Gold perhaps, or perhaps only the shadow of history. Heavy, glittering, and unspoken. Tonight, as the warm wind moves through the bamboo and the stars drift above the dark ridges of Luzon, we descend into that silence, into the legend that still sleeps beneath the soil. It was the closing act of a long and brutal play. The year was 1945, and Japan's empire, once stretched like a steel shadow across the Pacific, was folding in on itself. The thunder of artillery that had shaken the islands for years was now only distant rumbling, echoing across valleys filled with mist and smoke. In the Philippines, the humid air hung thick with the scent of rain and rust, the smell of endings. In Manila and throughout Luzon, the retreating Japanese forces moved not as an army, but as a tide receding into the jungle. They left behind burned villages, silent airfields, and rumors, whispers of convoys carrying something more precious than soldiers. In dim-lit bunkers, officers unfurled maps across tables, stained with coffee and oil, tracing routes that wound like veins through the mountains. The orders were clear, delivered in hushed tones and sealed envelopes. Secure the cargo, hide it, let no one find it. The cargo, it was said, came from across the occupied territories: gold, diamonds, religious icons, ceremonial weapons, even crates of ivory and jade, carved with forgotten dynasties' emblems. To the officers, these were requisitioned assets. To those from whom they were taken, they were the soul of cultures, stolen in the fever of conquest. Late at night, in a warehouse near Baguio, engineers inspected the crates before loading them onto flatbed trucks. They moved with ritual precision, lifting, counting, sealing, aware that they were preparing not just a shipment but a myth. Outside, rain hissed softly against corrugated metal. A colonel with sharp eyes and an unreadable face watched, his gloved hands clasped behind his back. Once it leaves here, he murmured, it must never return. By dawn, the convoy was ready. Diesel engines coughed to life, their sound swallowed by the wet air. Soldiers climbed aboard, faces drawn, movements mechanical. Each man carried not only his weapon, but an unspoken understanding: what they guarded would never be spoken of again. As the first trucks rolled into the jungle, the city lights of Baguio dimmed behind them, fading into the rising mist. The road ahead was narrow and treacherous, twisting through ravines and rivers swollen with monsoon rain. The men rode in silence, listening to the endless hum of insects and the steady rhythm of the engines. Above them, the canopy closed like a curtain, and the forest swallowed them whole. The empire was dying, but in its final breath, it sought to bury its wealth beneath the lungs of the earth, so that even in defeat, something of its power might endure. The journey into the interior began before sunrise. A pale light bled through the trees as the first trucks entered the narrow mountain paths of northern Luzon. Mist hung low over the valleys, curling around the headlights like smoke from a dying fire. The road was half mud, half memory. An old logging trail widened just enough for a single vehicle at a time. Every few miles, the soldiers stopped to listen. The war had taught them that danger was never loud at first, but all they heard now was the hum of cicadas, the dripping of rain from banana leaves, and the heavy sigh of their engines cooling. Some removed their helmets, letting the drizzle wash the sweat from their faces. Others prayed silently, fingers brushing against small paper charms sent from home. Inside the lead truck sat Major Tanaka, the officer in charge of the operation. He was a quiet man, his uniform immaculate despite the mud. On the seat beside him rested a leather-bound folder containing coordinates and coded symbols, circles, crosses, and characters that only the engineers could interpret. Tanaka had been told the operation's name only once: Kinno Sora, Sky of Gold. By midday, the convoy reached a river crossing. The bridge had long since collapsed, leaving only wooden beams jutting from the current like ribs. Without hesitation, the men began to lay planks across the water, working with practiced speed. Each hammer strike echoed through the forest, startling birds from the trees. The air smelled of sap and sweat and diesel. When they resumed, the sun was already sinking. Lanterns were lit, their orange glow flickering against the green walls of the jungle. The trucks climbed higher, engines straining as the trail narrowed into switchbacks carved into the mountainside. At one point, a wheel slipped on wet stone, sending pebbles tumbling into the ravine below. No one spoke. They pushed forward, one gear at a time, until the forest finally opened into a wide clearing surrounded by volcanic cliffs. Here, they made camp. Engineers unpacked surveying tools. Soldiers set up perimeter lights that looked like stars fallen to earth. The night deepened quickly, the air cooling to a heavy stillness. Somewhere beyond the firelight, something large moved through the brush, a boar perhaps, or a spirit disturbed from its rest. The men glanced toward the sound but said nothing. They had been told the mountains were haunted, but then again, so was the war. Under a sky scattered with thin clouds, the work began. The first tunnel marked, the first dig site chosen. The jungle, ancient and indifferent, watched them quietly. At first light, the engineers walked the cliff face with quiet reverence, reading the rock the way a navigator reads a sky. They tapped with hammers and listened for hollows, pressed their palms to seams where basalt had cooled in long, patient waves, and marked each promising vein with chalk like pale moths resting on stone. A surveyor's level blinked a red eye in the mist. A plumb bob stilled by a breath told them when a line was true. The jungle exhaled around them, wet leaves, fern musk, the faint iron of distant rain. They began with pilot cuts, narrow mouths braced with timber, angled to shed water and confusion. Inside, picks rang like bells, then softened into the deeper thud of earth giving way. Lanterns stitched orange ellipses along the walls. Soot curled upward and painted the ceiling with the night. Someone chalked characters near the entrance, words half prayer, half instruction, and an officer nodded. There would be many chambers, but only some would matter. The rest would be stories the mountain told to mislead. When the first vault widened enough for work, steel ribs went in, arched, riveted, a hidden cathedral raised to silence. Concrete followed in low, even pours, smoothed with trowels whose handles had the shine of tools often used and never named aloud. Air vents were disguised as crevices and snake holes. A drainage trench slipped beneath the floor, lipped to swallow any storm the monsoon could send. They fitted the forms like memory, and then they waited, and then they built again. Crates arrived on canvas slings, The men who carried them did not read their contents, only their weight. Gold makes a different sound when set down, dense, ceremonial, a note that stops the room. A Buddha passed through the lamplight, its face serene as if it understood time in a way none of them did, and was wrapped again, its features erased by layers of cloth. The ledger clerk wrote nothing at all. Numbers here would be more dangerous than ignorance. A colonel merely touched a corner with one finger and said, "Enough." They wove the last measures like traps in a story. False doors to nowhere, steps that ended at a slipped stone, an angled gallery that filled if 2 bolts were pulled. Charges were placed where only a frightened impulse could find them. The true wall thickened to the length of a man's body, aggregate locked like teeth. When it set, they breathed in, all at once, and heard only their own breath. At dusk, they rolled boulders against the mouth and dressed the wound with fern and vine. A few strips of bark were nailed to a trunk. In the code the engineers knew. Then there was a pause, quiet, long, a tide pulling back. One man pressed his forehead to the rock and whispered something to a father far away. Another scratched a date with a nail over his heart. The mountain listened and closed its book. The lights were doused. Night gathered the scaffolds into shadow and folded them away. Above, the stars took their positions as if none of this had happened at all. By September, the war had turned to ash and paper. General Tomoyuki Yamashita stood not as a roar, but as a held breath, a soldier wrapped in the quiet of consequences. He surrendered with that particular stillness. The exhausted learn, the kind that makes footsteps sound like rain. The jungle behind him had already begun to erase what men had written in it. Trails softened, tire ruts feathered by grass, a hillside where a timber brace had become simply another log. Interrogations followed, as they must. Questions came dressed in many uniforms, legal, moral, historical, yet Yamashita's answers wore a single coat, brevity. He spoke of command structures and units, deployments and withdrawals. He spoke like a man who respected the fact of speech but not the comfort it might offer. When questions sought specificity, maps, convoys, vaults, he let the air fill the room. The silence had posture. It was not a failure to recall, but the decision to let memory become landscape. Rumor trails grew where proof would not. Some said he never knew. Others said he knew and chose the more difficult duty, keeping the dead from meaningless disturbance. The secretary remembered a file that contained only a pressed leaf. A guard remembered a night when the general woke and stood at a window until dawn, as if saluting something no one else could see. During the trial, the world tried to decide if the weight of command could be weighed like gold. Witnesses spoke. Verdicts settled like dust. Through it all, the general kept that stillness, and the legend found oxygen not in what he confessed, but in what he refused to turn into sound. After sentence, there were no sudden revelations, no late-hour maps slipped beneath a door. There was only the long, straight hallway, and a door that opened once. In the archives later, the paperwork became its own jungle. Boxes labeled with years, ties loosened, ink fading to the color of eucalyptus. Somewhere between an index card and a memo, a clerk doodled a small mountain with an eye in it. That eye looked out across the decades and said nothing, which is another way of saying, the story chose its keeper, and it was the land. What did the general know? Enough to understand that the quickest way to bury a treasure is to let people dig for it forever. Enough to trust the patience of rain. In hamlets near the passes, elders tell of platoons that walked into fog and were absorbed by it. No gunfire, no cry, only a thinning of figures until the green swallowed the last shoulder. Some were guards assigned to the second gates. Some were engineers whose hands were more familiar with angles than rifles. When the last seals were set, orders narrowed to a single word that men had always obeyed easily. Waiting like stone insists on shape. They made camp near the mouths. They cooked rice that smelled of metal and wood smoke. They mended socks with thread the color of river mud. A few strung a line and washed shirts that never quite dried. In the evening, they wrote letters. They would not send and told each other stories that had less battle in them than one might expect. A winter boat on a lake at home. The taste of buckwheat noodles in a stall where steam wrote music on glass. Then the counters left. The folders closed, and the war became a drum far away. No relief came. Rations thinned. the jungle moved closer like a guest who would not be introduced. Some men went inward and stayed there. Others walked into the tunnels at dawn and spoke to the dark as if it were a friend who simply needed time to answer. One tied prayer papers to a root, another left a sweet at the threshold for a god he had never named. Years earlier, carpenters had learned how to hide a joint so the beam looked whole. Now time did the same work to these men. Their names loosened from the world and drifted like spores. A hunter found a spoon with careful engraving. A girl collecting kindling found a nail that had once been a ring. In a dry season, a skull winked from a bank, and then, with the first rain, was again a hill. The soldiers who never returned as weather and habit. A pause before stepping into shade. A hat removed, unconsciously. When passing a certain boulder, the mind keeps its own altars. And so, when the elders speak, they do so with the same respect they show a tree older than grandparents. They are still on duty, an old man says, and nobody laughs, because everybody understands what duty looks like when it is a mountain. Stories entered kitchens on the feet of those who fetched water. A boy told his mother that the stream sang different after the great thunder, meaning the blast that sealed a side tunnel, and the mother said, "Then we will not fish there today." A farmer noticed a line of rocks that never grew moss, and set his plow to curve around it the way one avoids a sleeping dog. People learn a terrain's preferences and call it courtesy. Market days collected the rumors and arranged them in baskets. A coin traded for salt, a strip of cloth printed with a chrysanthemum, a map scratched on a palm leaf, then rubbed away before a soldier could read the hand. In the churchyard, candles burned for all manner of intentions: crops, exams, safe births, and the ones no one wrote on paper, that the ground keep its peace. The children loved the parts about guardians: a white deer that watched from the ridge, a headless drummer whose rhythm kept time for the rain, a nun with a lantern who walked the trail on fog nights and turned anyone who followed her back toward home with a glance that felt like the exact weight of mercy. Do not chase lights, mothers said, meaning many things at once: ambition, gold, love that arrives with too much promise. When a cousin from the city came with investors and instruments, the elders greeted him with rice wine and stories so soft he mistook them for yes. He showed a screen with lines that looked like veins, said, "Here is the chamber," and pointed to a bright island in a green sea. The old men nodded at the beauty of the image and sent him to the teacher, who kept a key to the footpath. On that path, gears and plans moved slower because the slope had its own opinions. Legend hardened into etiquette: leave an offering if you pass the old baleti tree. Do not whistle near the ravine. If you find metal, rebury it, unless you are prepared to feed the village for a year. Hospitality is the practical half of myth. The other half is remembering that a mountain is never only one thing. Under the vines are walls. Under the walls are older vines. Under all of it is the patient pulse of something that knows how to wait. In the first years of peace, paper became brave again. Men who had folded maps into shoes now unfolded them on cafe tables. The lines looked like children's drawings of rivers, all bends and ambition, but in the margins were notations that made the eyes narrow. 3 dots in a triangle watch post, a star inside a square sealed, a ladder drawn sideways, 2 levels. The ink had bled in the rain. The intention had not. American soldiers stationed nearby heard the talk and filed it under the category: everything lively belongs to rumor. Still, a few collected fragments the way others collected postcards. A sergeant kept a notebook of place names he could not pronounce, and doodled an X beside the ones locals repeated without thinking. He wrote letters home about the light on the rice terraces at dusk, and did not mention the elderly woman who had pointed with her chin and said, "The hill that remembers," as if hills had personal histories. A Manila bookseller learned to recognize the treasure seeker by the speed with which his fingers found the spines of geology reports. He kept a thin folder behind the counter, articles about wartime stores of currency, photographs of caves with captions like teeth, a clipping of a trial notice in which the general's name appeared like a stone in a stream everyone had to cross. He added a poem once, about a coin tossed into a well and the wish that followed, because it seemed honest to keep the record equal parts fact and wanting. Villagers sometimes sketched maps in ash on the ground, not because they trusted the visitor, but because the act itself made the space between people a little easier to live in. From the mango, 10 paces, someone would say, and the outsider would smile too quickly, not understanding that mangoes grow and die, and that paces lengthen as knees age. The mountain watched them measure each other, and shook a few leaves loose to remind them of scale. Soon there were drawers full of guides that did not guide, compasses that spun a beat too fast, and dreams that woke men at 3 a.m. with the sensation of cold stone under palms. The post-war years were a tide coming in and going out, bearing with it tin toys and white shirts, and the last of the ration biscuits, and always, always a small slip of paper with a line that said, "Here." Rogelio Roxas learned locks, because the world liked to close. He had the patient wrists of a man who appreciates the difference between force and persuasion. In Baguio, the fog came and went the way a thought does, and in those quiet dissolves, he began to assemble a story from fragments others had thrown away. A pale map inked by a Japanese hand, a tale told by a man whose brother had carried ropes into the hills and not returned. A policeman's memory of a crate moved at night that was so heavy. 4 men groaned, and still it barely parted from the ground. He was not foolish, which is to say he understood that treasure breaks more lives than it repairs, yet the map had a corner that echoed a path he had walked as a boy, where tree roots looked like knuckles. Recognition is a door. He found companions, men with shovels, one with a lantern that did not flicker in wind, another with a laugh that made fear stand at the edge and wait its turn. They ate bread that tasted of iron and sweet coffee that turned to courage in the mouth, and they climbed. The hillside offered its ordinary gifts, leeches that taught gratitude for salt, thorns that taught slowness, a sudden clarity when mist opened, and the valley spread below like a calm green lake. Roxas touched a stone and felt the temperature of certainty. They began where the map and the body agreed, a notch in the slope, a particular echo when a boot struck ground. Picks rose and fell in a rhythm older than borders. Days passed in work measured not by clocks, but by the lamp's appetite for fuel. The first cavity surprised no one. The mountain has many pockets. The second smelled of old metal. On the 7th night, a strike sounded different. Hollow, yes, but not the hollow of a tunnel, the hollow of a made thing. They widened with fingers as much as tools, palms learning the story of a seam. The opening breathed stale air into their faces, and they went still, like men listening to a sleeping child. What came next arrived, wrapped in dust, and the sense that someone else in some other time had paused here too. Cloth peeled from a curved surface, gold when it meets light, after years in the dark, does not shout. It glows like a held note. The Buddha's face gathered their lanterns and gave them back softer. Someone said a word that was half prayer, half name. The room adjusted to include a new weight. Roxas set his palm to the statue's shoulder. Warmth is not the right word, but it is the only word any of them had. They worked in whispers, though there was no one to wake. The chamber held a Buddha, and the lives stitched to it, bayonets like exclamation marks abandoned mid-sentence, a helmet with a leaf nested where a head should have been, bones that had not asked to be artifacts. The air had that tick of damp stone cooling that makes a man think of clocks he cannot hear. They lit another lamp, because more light is how humans argue with awe. The statue did not want to leave. That is how it felt as they levered it with poles, as if its gravity had grown loyal to the room. They padded it with blankets that had known other labors, babies carried to christenings, rice sacks, an overcoat from a season colder than this one, and eased it toward the mouth. Outside, the mist consented to witness. A dog barked and then reconsidered. The moon wrote a careful line along the ridge and closed its book. They did not take everything. No one takes everything who intends to stay human. A box half collapsed offered coins salted to the color of dusk. A ledger had bound itself to the shelf with the patience of mildew and would not be convinced. A corner of the room hinted at more rooms, and that hint was both invitation and mercy. They decided at a glance, without a vote, that the next decision would be made on a day when their hands were steadier. Moving the Buddha down the slope required a choreography older than words. The count for lifting, the lay of a rope, the small sips of water between strains. At the creek crossing, the statue seemed to watch its face become a story told by ripples and then withdraw, but a little wiser about light. By the time they reached the shed, morning had turned toward the notion of afternoon. News travels at the speed of breath held. A cousin mentioned a cousin. A man with an interest appeared, and then another, and then authority arrived, wearing the right shoes, and a face that said, "Explain." Explanations were offered and refused, as if they were cups of tea. The guest had not ordered. Papers wanted signatures. Rooms wanted to be searched. The Buddha, wrapped in cloth, was led away by men who promised it would be safer in their keeping. Safety is a word with wide shoulders. That night, the shed held only the impress of a heavy absence. The men sat with their hands open on their knees, as if gold had taught them how to rest. Outside, rain began, at first with the politeness of fine print, and then as the main text of the weather. Roxas did not sleep, neither did the mountain. Morning is when inventory happens, of grain, of tools, of damages. Roxas's inventory compiled not things but erasures. A phone number that used to answer with laughter now answered with a tone. A neighbor who had watched the hillside with him became suddenly concerned about an aunt and shut his door. Footsteps slowed outside his house at unnatural hours, the street learning a new rhythm that was not the town's. He reported a theft and met the look officials keep for men who mistake weather for conspiracy. Forms were filled. The grammar of bureaucracy did what it always does, turned urgency into rows and columns. A polite officer assured him that property properly documented is property properly protected. The statue, of course, had been an irregular citizen. Irregular citizens have a way of becoming hypothetical. Conversations shortened. Friends said they wanted to help, and then their children needed shoes. Someone suggested he sell the story. He laughed, which surprised him because there are many currencies, and he had just learned a new one. Silence. Denials arrived in uniform. No such operation, no such seizure, no such statue. The shape of absence is convincing when repeated. Roxas returned to the hill and stood where the path first narrows. A bird called in a register he could not place. The mouth of the tunnel looked like a healed wound. He did not go in. Sometimes care is a kind of bravery. In markets, copies of maps began to multiply. Crisp black lines over photocopied topography, an ink halo where the toner had thought a ridge was a word. Every seller claimed his version had provenance. Provenance, like perfume, becomes a cloud everyone shares. Somewhere in the city, someone placed the Buddha in a room with no windows. Somewhere else, a ledger acquired a new page with numbers arranged to resemble alibis. The country learned, again, the taste of stories that cannot be proved and therefore last longer. Roxas purchased a notebook with a blue cover and began to write. Details first, then weather, then thoughts worn smooth by recitation. The act of writing is sometimes the act of becoming real. The page does not argue. It accepts the weight and keeps it. Paper grew teeth. Affidavits gathered like a season. A suit was filed. A countersuit arrived before lunch. Motions learned how to dance in pairs. The story stood in front of judges who had seen wars both loud and quiet, and the law tried to make room for a Buddha that may or may not have been exactly what witnesses swore it was. The courtroom air was chilled to discourage fever. Politics watched from the gallery and sent notes down the aisle. The era wanted certain narratives more than others. Infrastructure announced its virtues. Parades instructed the nation where to look. Banks hummed like well-fed bees. Treasure is an inconvenient subplot. It suggests the past has not finished deciding what to do with the present. Roxa swore with a hand that did not shake. He described the breadth of the chamber and the weight of the ropes. A clerk transcribed breath as breeze, which changed the temperature of the sentence. An expert declared that gold statues of a certain weight were improbable and therefore unlikely, and improbability made itself comfortable in the benches. Yet unimprobable things are the country's specialty. Miracles beside highways, healings on hills, mango harvests that defy arithmetic. When papers were requested from ministries, some were produced with the diligence of men who cherish staplers. Others had been struck by a tidy catastrophe, misfiled, mislaid, lost in flood. Flood is efficient. It washes both truth and error to the same ocean. In a deposition, someone said they had seen a statue moved at night under blankets that did not drape like blankets usually do. The record reflected this as transport of unidentified equipment, and a page turned. The trial's true verdict was time. Proceedings lasted long enough for seasons to perform their entire repertoire. In one winter of memory, pine needles fell through a skylight in a way that made everyone look up and then immediately pretend they had been studying their notes. Some cases end with a gavel. Others end with the feeling that a room has decided to breathe differently. Roxas left the building into a city that had learned to refer to him by adjectives. He became cautionary, legendary, bothersome, brave, misled, steadfast, mistaken, necessary. On a bench nearby, a child licked ice cream and watched a red kite fight the wind. Even arguments need weather to live in. Legends prefer corridors with echoes. The country obliged. Radio hosts rehearsed the tale until they could tell it without blinking. Musicians pinned its outline to a melody, and grandmothers found ways to let a moral rise politely from the last spoon of halo halo. Gold teaches patience, one said. Another countered, gold teaches hunger, and hunger is loud, and both were correct in the way seas are correct no matter which way they roll. Documentaries arrived with the careful boots of men who carry cameras over rivers. There were frames of green upon green, a drone's eye adoring a ridge, a narrator whose consonants trusted microphones more than rain. Interviews arranged themselves into a geometry that looked like argument but felt like weather patterns. In the commentaries, maps bloomed like weeds, lines over lives, X's over everything. The mountain was polite to the drones and taught them crosswinds. In bars, men drew vaults on napkins and convinced each other that a particular angle guaranteed a chamber below, as if the ground responded to geometry like a host to a knock. In schools, history teachers answered students with the kind of shrug that contains both curiosity and curriculum. In churches, a candle lit for lost things now included a statue whose name could not be written on the petition line without the pen pressing too hard. Truth, meanwhile, continued the work it prefers, remaining itself whether noticed or not. It sat in a room somewhere, perhaps in a ledger entry, perhaps in a man's quiet memory, perhaps under a boulder as elemental as sleep, and watched stories breed. When legends expand beyond truth, they put on bright clothes, but underneath they still want what truth wants, a place to rest where they will not be harmed by certainty. In the evenings, the ridge lines darkened into the old animal shapes. Children pointed and said, "Carabao," and mothers nodded and said, "Yes," and also a dragon, because both looked like guardians if you squinted kindly. The legend became part of the country's furniture, a chair everyone used without remark, a mirror one glances at when leaving the house, just to make sure the face still knows itself. The new century arrived with batteries. Explorers came carrying screens that translated ground into color. LiDAR combed the canopy, returning with hairline notches where old paths hid like whispers under green. Ground-penetrating radar laid grids over clearings and showed the past as a quilt of densities. The machines made a gentle purr in the shade, like hives that had learned mathematics. Teams wore hats printed with logos and hope. They placed sensors in rows so tidy. The jungle smiled and tilted a vine across one just to keep the conversation honest. Monitors bloomed with anomalies, bright almonds of promise, deep blue caves that could be geology or design. Each blip was a hand raised at the back of a classroom, asking to be chosen. Digs began with briefings and ended with tea. Between those two appropriate acts lay mud and the reminders it issues, boots that explore on their own, ropes that negotiate with friction, data that declines to behave like prophecy. A reading suggested a void, the ground suggested a rock, the spade suggested patience. The team agreed to believe all three and widened the square. Occasionally, something surfaced that felt like sentence rather than syllable, a poured wall too straight for accident, a rail embedded in clay, a nail whose head bore knurling like a fingerprint. Findings were bagged, tagged, argued over, blessed, then placed in boxes that felt too light for the meaning they claimed. The data went home on hard drives, the hill kept the rest. At night, camps glowed with the pale blue of spreadsheets. An engineer tapped a key and showed a cross-section that looked like a canyon cut into silence. A historian pointed to a slope and said, "This is where the old road ran," and two disciplines shook hands across a ditch. The storm that came at 2 a.m. made everything equal: scientist, porter, ant, under the drumming of rain that did not care which century anyone belonged to. The next morning, the hill smelled new and exactly the same. Batteries went into chargers, men into socks that weren't quite dry, and faith into the modest pockets where humans keep it without making a scene. The mountain watched the arrangements and kept score in a ledger no one would ever audit. Even machines do not walk alone. The hill had its own entourage, and the old stories introduced them to the new guests as if hosting a party. The soldier who kept the second watch eternally and nodded once, if your heart was steady. The child who laughed near the ravine and was only laughter, nothing to chase. The grandmother who dipped her hand into the stream and could tell from the water's skin whether the day would require bravery or only bread. Entrances do not always look like doors. Some were a sudden coolness on the skin at noon. Some were a pattern of ferns that replicated a key. Some were a smell like coins after rain. Explorers who believed in such clues found their way to edges where the ground changed mind. There, the labyrinth made its suggestions, left into history, right into geology, straight into patience. Inside, stone spoke. It said the short words first: wet, wait, wait, and then longer ones that took the shape of chambers. Graffiti from the war glimmered under lichen, a cartoon tiger, a date that added up to courage, a name scratched with the pocket knife of a boy pretending to be the man the uniform said he was. A rosary, hung from a nail that had forgotten it, once held a lantern. Someone whispered a prayer, not because ghosts demanded it, but because gratitude did. Flood traps slept like cats. Floors tested souls with a flex that asked, "Are you here out of hunger or out of care?" A dragonfly rode the beam of a headlamp for a minute, then turned back to a pool where the air spelled its name in rings. The deeper turns had that hush schools get on holidays. Even echoes obeyed. The spirits, if that is the name for the mind remembering itself, did not impede. They kept their jobs to discourage the greedy, to welcome the gentle, to flatten the ego that strides, to strengthen the humility that kneels. A gift left on a stone, rice, a flower, a coin chosen for its story rather than its worth, taught the ground that the visitor understood terms. The labyrinth softened its shoulders, and an hour unfolded that would otherwise have been a wall. Defense here is not a barricade, but a choreography. Vines choose angles that turn ladders into statements. Ants reroute expeditions. With the insistence of the well-organized, roots write their own treaties beneath survey stakes, lifting them half an inch per season until the instruments agree to look again with less certainty. Moss dresses everything in a uniform whose rank is quiet. When a crew leaves, the hill returns to the shape that fits its breath. Footprints note their news briefly, then blend into the grammar of leaf and loam. A tarp corner flaps and then rests. A twine flag turns from red to a memory of red. A trench offers its sides to the slow festival of collapse. Nothing here is erased. Everything is rephrased as green. Storms teach the syllabus twice a year. The first lesson is that plans must bend. The second is that bending is not defeat. After a typhoon, the path announces a new logic and expects your compliance. The river relocates the idea of midstream. A boulder decides after decades to be 3 smaller boulders and a set of seats where people tell stories. The jungle's defense is hospitality so thorough it includes your difficulty and makes room for your return. At the edge of camp, a boy from the village watches the machines sleep. He can name 20 birds by call and none of the anomalies by number. He points to a gap in the trees and says, "That is where the wind learns to turn." The team leader notes it on a map and 3 weeks later discovers a problem he can only solve by moving with the wind exactly there. Local knowledge is not quaint, it is the operating system. By the time the season closes, the jungle has restored its preferred sentences. The hill wears a slight smile, only those who have listened for months can see. It is the expression of a host whose guests have left the table cleaner than they found it. Down in the lowlands, the city screens will display lines and colors, and the report will propose next steps. Up on the ridge, a fern will unfurl a fraction of an inch, which is how agreements are kept here. Gold is metal that learned how to tell the truth about light. In the dark it keeps a memory, and when brought into a room, it returns what the flame offers without envy. People mistake that for greed's ally. It is not. Gold is patient and largely indifferent. The wanting happens in us. In cathedrals and barrios, in palaces and small kitchens, the idea of gold has done its work. Funding, adorning, promising, betraying, redeeming. A nation is not made of it, and yet economies bow toward it the way sunflowers bow toward their noon. In a cave beneath Lausanne, if a Buddha sits with dust layered into a robe by decades, the meaning of that gold reaches beyond currency. It becomes a mirror. Those who find it see themselves first. What would it buy if brought to light? Roads that tell better stories with fewer potholes. Clinics where dawn begins in compassion. Schools that teach the algebra of hope and the chemistry of patience. What would it cost? The quiet of hills that have made their peace with keeping. The sanctity of bones that learn to belong to soil. The humility of a country that knows some of its treasures are verbs, not nouns. Roxas knew this a little and learned it more. The courtrooms taught him the price of naming. The hillside taught him the price of reaching. Between those two, a truth sits. Sometimes the treasure is not extraction but restraint. To stand at a mouth of stone and feel the mind still. To breathe and call that breath enough. To let the possibility remain possibility so it can continue to bless rather than obligate. Gold truly means this, value that outlives value. A wedding ring after hands forget tasks. A chalice after prayers learn silence. A statue after the men who hid it become river and fern. If you carry any of it out, carry also the understanding that light needs darkness to make sense, and that taking all the darkness away is not the point. Nations wear memory like shawls, some woven of victory, some of grief, some of riddles they keep touching even when busy. Yamashita's gold is a riddle that found a comfortable weight on the shoulders of the Philippines. It belongs alongside songs that cannot decide if they are love or lament, alongside fiestas that laugh beside tombs because both are honest. Ask 10 people what the treasure means, and learn the inventory of a country's heart. A farmer says tuition, a teacher says instruments, a grandmother says time, a boy says a motorbike whose color can be heard from a block away, an artist says leave it, and draws with charcoal a Buddha made of rain. A banker says account for it, and points to columns that behave like orchards only when watered. A priest lights a candle and says nothing, which is also an answer. Myth here is not the opposite of truth. It is its envelope. The stamp bears a mountain. The postmark is permanent. Children learn the outlines before they know the dates, which is how lore works when it intends to last. They will grow into the specifics later, into the sieges and trials, into names that take work to pronounce. Meanwhile, they keep the gesture. A small bow when passing a certain tree, a pause before throwing a stone into any hole that looks like a mouth. When visitors come with their cameras and their crisp questions, the country offers both hospitality and boundary. Guides point to ridges and talk about weather and war with equal expertise. Souvenir stands, sell small golden Buddhas that look wise and full of patience. Somewhere, an elder tells a child, "We keep what keeps us," and the child nods, fitting that sentence into the pocket where citizenship lives. Memory, in the national sense, is not a museum, it is a river. Some days it runs clear, and you can count pebbles at the bottom. Some days it carries silt, and you navigate by sound. The gold story, dropped into that current, tinks against stones, and teaches rhythm. The country hums that rhythm while building, while grieving, while laughing over soup. It is a timekeeper without a clock. Acceptance is not surrender. It is the choosing of a scale that matches reality. The mountain is large. The human hand is deft. Between those two, mystery stands and introduces them properly, so they will not be rude. To accept that some questions prefer to be lived beside rather than solved is to become native to the place one inhabits. Picture the hillside at dusk. The light takes its time deciding where to go next. You stand where the path opens into a small brow overlooking terraces that look like steps the gods forgot to climb. You know the stories now: convoys, vaults, signatures that vanished, a statue that learned to be everywhere by being nowhere. You feel the want rise like a small animal and sit down beside it. You put your hand on its back. You both watch the mist rehearse the old miracle of appearing from nothing and becoming all. The quiet acceptance of mystery is a discipline learned from rivers and old women. It says, dig when needed, but plant more often. It says, if you must take, leave 3 kindnesses behind. It says, the telling of a story is a kind of tending, and the best tended stories grow shade. Under that shade, strangers can rest without explaining who they are. So we let the treasure sleep, not because we are timid, but because we are brave enough to love the world with some of its doors closed. We let the guardians keep their posts, whether they wear boots or roots. We let the tunnels echo with their own grammar. We let the statue, if it sits, hold the room in a silence that does not wound. Acceptance is the last engineering, the fitting of the mind to the mountain so the structure stands. Night returns to the Cordillera with the practiced grace of an old dancer. One by one, the ridgelines darken from green to indigo, to a tenderness that does not require a name. Down in the folds, water goes about its tasks, taking leaf to silt, stone to sand, heat to steam, and in that steady arithmetic, everything human finds its right fraction. Breathe in, as the jungle breathes in, slow, warm, generous. Breathe out, as the jungle breathes out, soft, even forgiving. Above the terraces, a thin band of cloud becomes a road for moonlight. Houses hush. Dogs arrange themselves into circles of comfort. Somewhere a radio lowers itself by a notch until the singer sounds like she has stepped back into the kitchen to check the stew. A mother tucks a child's foot back under a blanket and smooths hair the way the wind smooths grass. The mountain keeps its counsel. Beneath roots that twist like braided stories, beneath gravel that contains yesterday's storm, beneath the level where ants draw maps no general could read, rooms may wait, or not. What is certain is this: the earth knows how to hold. It holds seed and memory with equal fairness. It holds grief until it becomes a kind of soil from which gentler afternoons can grow. It holds metal without scorn, and gives it back to light only when the exchange will not hurt the day. Inhale, and imagine the cool of stone under your palm, the way temperature carries time. Exhale, and let the wanting settle like dust in a shaft of sun no one will step through just yet. Somewhere perhaps a Buddha sits, perhaps only the idea of a Buddha, mercy given shape, patience given weight. If it is there, it is not lonely. The drip finds the same rock again and again, and the rock offers its patience to the drip, and together they compose a small song that taught the world how to count to forever. Stars arrive shyly, and then all at once. They are coins someone spilled across a dark table, yes, but they are also eyes, and also seeds of the next morning, and also just stars, which is enough. Your breath finds them and matches their calm. Your hands loosen. The jaw, unhooks from its day. The heart learns for a few good minutes how to be only a bell that rings when kindness touches it. We leave the hills as we found them, guarded by crickets, stitched with paths no map can keep, conversant with rain. We leave the story where it belongs, in the care of the listeners who will carry it forward, not as proof but as practice. The practice of looking gently at what you cannot open. The practice of letting the unopened teach you how to rest. Breathe in to the count of 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold to the count of 2. 1, 2. Breathe out to the count of 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Again, softer. In 2, 3, 4. Hold. 1, 2. Out. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The ridge is a shoulder. The cloud is a blanket. The wind is a hand that knows your name. Everything that needed saying has been said tonight, and everything that needed keeping has been kept. Sleep now while the treasure sleeps. Sleep while the guardians keep watch. Sleep and let the mountain dream you kindly into morning.